Another landmark case where the Indian judiciary contributed significantly, whether positively or negatively, is the Konkan Railway case 1992, where again the Bombay High Court, this Konkan Railway project was challenged before the court, citing that a number of trees had to be cut for facilitating this Konkan Railway project, and also because of the environmental implications this project was going to cause. But however, the court took a different view, and court justified the Konkan Railway project by highlighting the necessity of such a railway line. Let me quote an important paragraph from this Konkan Railway case 1992 is, I quote, "The project of such magnitude of providing the rail line passing through more than 3 states cannot be held back by catering to the alleged grievance of the petitioners that the trees are indiscriminately cut." What we can see, a common element from this Konkan Railway case as well as from the previous Goa Foundation case on housing colony, is that the court makes certain decisions, and the court steps into the bureaucratic role, and or court steps into the role of the executive and decides what all activities can be permitted or what are the activities not to be permitted in the forest as per the Forest Conservation Act. Because one common element in both these cases are the setting up of housing colonies or a development project to the degree of a Konkan Railway were justified on the ground that this is of national importance. Konkan Railway project was justified on the ground that this was for national importance, so little implications on forest could be considered as inevitable if we wanted to have this kind of project. Whereas in the case of housing colony, this was disapproved, or this was not recognized by the judiciary, by the court, by the Indian judiciary as an activity to be permitted in the interest of public. And here another important point is the court is making, or court is defining what is the public interest, or what kind of project, irrespective of the fact that whether they cause implications or adverse implications on forest, what kind of activities can be permitted in the interest of public. While Konkan Railway project was identified as a project that should be permitted in the interest of public, housing colony projects were considered as not to be permitted in the interest of public, where the court gave more weightage to the ecological part of conserving forest, whereas in the case of Konkan Railway project the court gave more importance to the development project and considered the implications on the Western Ghat forest, the rainforest in Western Ghat, as inevitable to facilitate an essential development project. Similarly, in another case, which is Bandhi Seva Ashram case decided by the Supreme Court in 1987, this is a case regarding approval of a National Thermal Power Corporation plant, and and the question was whether such a plant was to be permitted in the forest area. And again I quote first the major paragraph or major portion from this decision. I quote, "We cannot lose the sight of the fact that for industrial growth as also for provision of improved living facilities, there is a great demand in this country for energy. A scheme to generate electricity therefore is equally of national importance and cannot be deferred." So again I would like your attention again to compare it with the Konkan Railway case, and here again court is coming up, the Supreme Court has come up with a definition on what is public interest. So what are the major public development projects, or what are the development projects that can be justified in the interest of public even if it causes adverse implications or it causes injury to the critical ecological critical part, even if it causes adverse implications on forest habitats in the country. So here I would like to underline this important part, like the court specifically and explicitly mentioned that we need industrial growth and we need electricity and we need energy. So if to facilitate some of these projects that can produce electricity or produce energy, so the court was of the opinion indirectly that we have to compromise some part of the ecological aspects of protecting forest. To put in a different way, in order to facilitate the economic development or in order to facilitate the project, like whether it is Konkan Railway or it is a project to produce electricity or energy, in such cases the court gave more weightage to developmental project than on than to the idea of or the purpose of conservation of project. So these are the few examples, I mean, where we can see that different that the provisions in the Forest Conservation Act, even though the act was primarily meant for the conservation of forest, these different definitions, so the scope of the statute has been defined differently according to the facts and circumstances of the case. For example, in one case where a housing colony was not accepted as an activity to be permitted in the forest, whereas Konkan Railway and an NTPC project for producing electricity, and these two projects were accepted and identified as a necessary project to be implemented, irrespective of the fact that it can cause adverse implications on the forest. Similarly, in the case of another major important thing or important changes introduced by the judiciary in the context of Indian Forest Act, Forest Conservation Act 1980 is umpika kurikis 1987, decided by the Supreme Court. And the major issue in this case was whether a license issued before the act came into force, and if an industry wants to renew their license during the regime of the 1980 Act, whether prior approval is necessary in such context. For example, in this case the company had its license before Forest Conservation Act 1980 came into force, and the company wanted to renew its license once the act came into force. So in this case the question was whether the government, the state government needs to seek prior approval from the central government or not. In this case the Supreme Court specifically held that renewal of a license after the Forest Conservation Act came into being can be made only after getting prior approval from the central government. And here is the case, the Supreme Court said that in the case of umpika mining industry, they had to, in that case the prior approval from the central government is mandatory, no matter whether license was issued before the act came into force. The renewal is considered. In this case what we can see is the court is again, I mean, it is unlike Konkan Railway case or the NTPC case. In this case the court is giving more importance to the protection of the forest habitat, as well as the implementation of the purposes of Forest Conservation Act 1980, and making this prior approval system applicable to all those licenses, or applicable to the instances of renewal of licenses or mining licenses issued before the act came into being. And another major contribution by the Indian judiciary is creation of ad hoc compensatory, which is called Ad Hoc Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Planning Authority. This is an important institutional mechanism introduced by the court. As per the Forest Conservation Act 1980, the central government was expected to constitute this body. However, even though a notification was issued, it never came into force, and this was the context in which the court introduced this idea of ad hoc organization, this ad hoc Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Planning Authority. The idea of this institutional mechanism is to manage the money received from the operation of act. Say for example, the money received as part of issuing licenses, and how this money can be used for better management of forest or for conservation and protection of forest. So now what can we see, or what can we witness from this judicial, the role played by the judiciary in terms of implementation of the Forest Conservation Act 1980. Even though the judiciary has widened the definition of the concept of forest, even though the judiciary has liberally interpreted the idea of non-forest purposes, there are several instances where the judiciary had taken different standards. For example, in the case of when they allowed some big projects, they refused to allow some small projects. And another major critique is that whether the Supreme Court, as it is doing in the case through the case of Godavarman case, whether the Supreme Court is able to micromanage forest administration. The capacity of the Supreme Court to micromanage forest administration is doubtful. And on top of that, even if the Supreme Court has the capacity to micromanage forest administration, is it proper according to the constitutional setup in India? For example, separation of, considering the idea of separation of power, whether it is proper for the Supreme Court to step into the role of executive, whether it is proper or whether we can justify it in the constitutional context. And again, what we can see is some of the rules or some of the decisions of the Supreme Court has actually triggered severe human rights violations. For example, the blind conservationism and the orders issued by the Supreme Court, on that basis it resulted in massive eviction of tribals and forest dependent communities, and that resulted in severe human rights violation. So the question is whether the Supreme Court actually had managed to balance, on the one hand, the conservation of forest, and on the other hand the concerns and the rights of tribals and other traditional forest dwellers. So and all these points and all these concerns will be too critical in analyzing the role played by the Indian judiciary as well as the implementation of forest laws in India. So in summary, what we can see is that forest law has a long history in India, and at the same time it was primarily started by the colonial state, and the colonial state's interest was primarily how to earn income from the use of forests, and their major purpose, and that is the major purpose, the primary purpose of introducing Forest Act in 1865 and to consolidate in 1927 was to enable the colonial state to exercise exclusive control over the forest, so that they can monitor forest activities in the forest and collect or levy duties properly. Later on, this resulted in a drastic deterioration of forest habitat, and later on, and that prompted the enactment of the Forest Conservation Act 1980, and 1980 Act and 1927 Act together, that constitute the major forest law regime in India. And on top of that, the Indian judiciary has played key role, whether positively or negatively, but they introduced key roles in shaping new roles or introducing new roles or widening the scope of Indian Forest Act, and also it is very important to highlight this point that the judiciary has been playing judiciary has assumed the role of executive in implementing the forest laws in India. Thank you.